Hey, everybody. I have a story to tell you. You know, my life from a work standpoint has predominantly been filled with two different areas. One would be construction projects, the other would be ministry. On the construction end, I've built a couple of homes from the ground up, the whole structure, the whole process. But mostly it's been remodels and maybe small additions, that kind of thing, smaller kind of projects. Um, and I've just kind of over the years spent my life, doing those kinds of things. And then ministry. And ministry's predominantly been missions work for the most part. So I want to tell you a story today that brings those two worlds into collision. So let's start with a construction project. A construction project here in the United States, typically, I'm used to things like, you do your planning and so forth, you get everything together and, you're ready for building supplies. Well, what do? You go down to one of the local building suppliers and you either collect all the materials yourself, but they're right there in the store, or if it's a big project, you give them your plans and they put together a takeoff list and they put together a list of everything that you need and they price it and they present you with a package price on everything you need. And then in the stages of the project where you need them, those materials are delivered to the work site, right? I mean, that's just kind of how it goes. You go through this process, you plan, you prepare, you order, and the materials show up. Then you work with the materials, you put together the project, and that's just kind of how it goes. We sometimes get disgruntled because maybe it doesn't go exactly how we want or whatever. But honestly, a project like that here in the United States, pretty smooth, pretty simple. Not too big of a deal. So in my life experience, I've done a lot of that. On the mission field, we have done a variety of different projects, a lot of ministry, evangelism, teaching in churches, leadership training, men's and women's ministries, and various things like that. But we've also done a fair number of building projects. So this is where my construction world and my missions world would collide in these moments when we're now doing a construction project on the mission field, right? So this is where the story just for me becomes so real and so fascinating, and definitely was a real catalyst in my life for change. So I want to take you to Nicaragua. Now, I don't know where you're at or what your background is as you watch this, but Nicaragua and Colorado, where I've spent most of my life, are two very different places. Colorado is dry and arid. Nicaragua and the jungle of Nicaragua, anything but dry and arid, right? Lots of moisture. Just picture with me, a thick jungle. You've seen it in the movies, probably. You've seen pictures, but a very thick jungle, lots of trees, lots of vegetation, lots of humidity, typically a lot of heat, um, lots of animals, right? Big and small. So here we are in Nicaragua, and we're venturing in to do a construction project. Specifically, we're helping to build a new church that's been planted. We're helping to build a building for this new church. So just getting there was an amazing adventure. We get into our vehicles and the final 25 miles or so to get there, probably, gosh, if I remember right, took about 4 hours because you're wandering on these dirt tracks, and hopefully it's not muddy and rainy. If it is, that complicates even further. But you're on these dirt tracks, and as you can imagine, lots of moisture means rivers, right? So we're driving along and you're having to navigate ruts in the road, and you're, of course, you're also, in my case, I'm coming from Colorado, so it's a whole new environment, right? So I'm awed by what's around me and what I'm seeing, and you're hearing out of one side of the vehicle. Of course, remember, we're in Nicaragua. It's hot, it's humid, we're going slow. And very often no air conditioning in the vehicle, right? So the windows are down, so you're hot, you're sweaty, but you're also hearing the sounds of the jungle. You're hearing the monkeys up in the trees and the birds and just all the ins and outs that go with a jungle like that. And you're moving along at a pretty slow pace, navigating these roads with ruts in them and so forth. And then you come to a river, and most of the time there's some sort of a makeshift bridge, right, that you're going to go across. But for the most part, I say makeshift because it's very likely what it is they've taken some trees, they've cut these trees down, and then they position these trees across the river. Maybe they use two, three, or four of these tree trunks, and they cut all the branches off, and then they lay some boards as best they can across, and they create a roadway. They create a bridge, they create a way for you to get across. And you're watching and you're just going, wow, are we gonna make it or not? Is this vehicle gonna be okay? A couple of times we even wondered enough, would this bridge hold us or not, that we would get out of the vehicle and we would let the most of the occupants walk across, and then the vehicle would drive across, helping to spread the weight out. So it's a crazy journey of crawling essentially back into the jungle in Nicaragua. And fascinating because you feel like you're going through some hardships, and then you begin to connect with reality, realizing there are people that live here. This is their world, this is their life. They don't leave home every day and run to the city to get groceries, or to get a treat or a snack or coffee or whatever, or even to go to work, because it's too much of a journey to get there. So, you start thinking about these things. You start thinking about the people that are living there. And here we are. There's been a church that's been started, and we're going for the purpose of beginning the process of building a building for them so they have a place to meet. And we've made this journey, all these new sights and sounds, and the experience of getting back in there. Now, remember, we're going back to a place where it's villages, it's jungle, it's very remote, right? This is not city. So there's not a Holiday Inn for us to check into, right? There's not those kinds of amenities that we're used to. So we have tents and all of our food supplies and ways to cook food. And man, I mean, it's a whole big to do. Those of you that maybe are into camping, maybe you could correlate, you could understand a bit what this is like, because basically we were camping, right? We're going back into the jungle to camp. So we're taking everything with us: a place to sleep, a sleeping bag, a tent, foods, and ways to cook that. And we finally, we make it out there. We make it after this amazing journey of going through the jungle. We make it out there, and we get to the site. And the first day is all about just getting there, which that in itself is such a lesson. We're used to things being so quick and efficient and readily supplied, that the whole first day was just about getting to the site. And then once you're at the site, it's all about setting up so that for the next week, you can work at building this church. So we get out there, we spend our first day, we get all set up and organized, and wow, what a journey already. Already, what has this been like? And here we are in the jungle, and it starts to get dark. And you're realizing, oh wow, there's not much light out here other than natural light, right? There's not much artificial light, very, very little. In fact, it was probably limited to the flashlights that we had taken with us, right? There are no street lights. There's none of this that we're used to lighting up our world, other than the natural light. And if it's a night with not much moonlight and so forth, then it can be very dark out there in the jungle. So here we are. We've made our way into the jungle. We've set up our camp. We're getting organized. We're getting used to things as much as we can, because it's a very foreign environment at this point. And of course, my construction head from Colorado has got its ideas and its images of how a construction project goes. But the next morning we get up, we do our best to get ourselves ready for the day, including having some breakfast, and just the challenges of cooking that over makeshift stoves and so forth. Of course, it's a whole team of us, right? So you're not just fending for yourself, but you're as a team working to have a camp that works, right? For our times there, for our time there. We're going to be there a week, right? I mean, and we're delighted to be there. We're not doing this under duress. We're thrilled to be there to help. So the next day we're up and we're getting ready and we go to the site. Now, keep in mind, and this was always true in our missions work, we were working with local people. These are people that this was going to be their church. And they were used to how they do things. They had built their own homes and so forth in this remote jungle village of Nicaragua. And so they had a different concept. I had my concept over here of a construction project in Colorado. They had their idea and understanding of a construction project in the jungle of Nicaragua. So here we are, we're there to help. And so we're gonna default to them and to how things work for them, because that's really what matters, right? It doesn't really matter what I see or think over here on this side. What matters is how do they do it. And so the lesson for me really began right at that moment, because one of the first things you need to build any building is some sort of structural material. Depending on where you are here in Colorado, we build with a lot of wood, a lot of lumber. I've got a lot of friends in Florida. They typically, if it's a one-story house, that first story is built with cement block. The second story might be built with wood, and they've got reasons for that. Wetter climate, drier climate, etc. So, already I'm starting to think some of these things and how are they going to do this? So here we are in Nicaragua, and I'm like, okay, we need some sort of a structural material. That's where you have to start. You can't put a roof on if you don't have a structure, if you don't have walls, if you don't have framing for your roof and some sort of foundation system. So we start out digging some holes, which makes sense, right? You've got to have some sort of a foundation, and that typically includes some digging of some kind and pouring of some concrete or whatever that looks like. So I'm looking around and I'm thinking, I wonder, how's this going to work in Nicaragua? I know in Colorado what I think, but how is this going to work here in Nicaragua? And I don't see like a pile of lumber sitting around, at a job site when we're ready to start framing. We would have a pile of lumber there that's been strategically purchased to what we're building. And it would have been delivered to our work site, right? And we would just tear into that lumber and begin framing our project. So I'm looking around and I'm thinking, well, there's not framing material. What are we going to do here? And one of the guys says, all right, let's go get some lumber. And I'm thinking, great. Where are we going? And I'm thinking about that trip that we just made the day before to get back to this site where our camp is now set up and to where we're building this church. And I'm thinking, that's going to be a big ordeal, right? I'm confused. I'm like, we're gonna go all that way back out that road and those ruts. And what about those bridges that were, really, in my view, very rickety, and by the way, once we get to wherever these building materials are, these framing materials, how are we going to haul these? We have a van, like a 15-passenger van that we brought a lot of our team in, and then we had a little SUV kind of, you can picture a small kind of little SUV of various kinds. We had a small one of those with us as well. No trailer, no truck. And I'm thinking, where are these building materials, right? No clue, no concept of what that looks like in Nicaragua. I've just got a view of this road and this jungle and the jungle that I see all around me. And they say, okay, well, let's go. And we're like, okay, well, we don't need all of us to go do this, right? So some people stayed and continued to dig holes for the foundation and so forth. But a handful of us go with a handful of the locals. We dive into our little SUV, and they have some sort of car or something. I mean, it wasn't much either. And we head off, and we go a little bit different way than what we came in. We went down a different jungle road. And I'm thinking, okay, there must be a Home Depot over here, right? I didn't actually think that, but it's humorous to look back on, and it was such a good life experience for me, because it's so interesting when you walk into something and you have no concept, right, of what you're going to experience or how things are going to work. That happens to all of us in life, right? So here we are trying to get these building materials, or I knew we needed these structural building materials. We head off and we drive for an hour or two, and we're just kind of going into the jungle. And I'm like, all right, next thing I know, we've got our little SUV stuck, So now you've got the adventure of this jungle all around you and this road that's incredibly makeshift. And now you've got this, it's wet all the time there, right? Compared to Colorado. So you've got these mud pits that you're driving this SUV through. I mean, you can picture it, right? Seriously, just in your mind's eye, just picture jungle all around you, constant, every day, wet, and rain happening. And of course, in the midst of all that, you've got various animals and insects and so forth that maybe we're not normally used to, and you're contending, with all of that as well. So here we are going out to get our building materials. We're going deeper and deeper into the jungle. And I'm just thinking, what are we doing here? No concept. We get the SUV unstuck and back onto semi-dry ground. And we finally come to this spot. And I see that they're already prepared. The day or two before we arrived, it hadn't been long, but just a day or two before, they had gone out to the jungle. And guess what they did that day or two before? You may already be tracking with me here. We need lumber, right? We're in the jungle. So they had, yes, you're already thinking it, I bet. They had cut some trees down. I know that the lumber at my local lumber yard comes from trees. What I don't know is the experience of taking it from a tree to lumber. But I know enough to know that it's a big process. Here in Colorado, you've got to take that lumber and cut it up and get it into the dimensions you want, and then it has to go through a process of drying, because we know that if we don't dry the wood, then if it's wet, then it's going to warp and do all kinds of weird things. And so we work really hard to cut that tree up into dimensions that we want. We don't. I've never done it. I just go to the lumber yard. But and by the time I'm getting it, it's all cut into the dimensions and so forth that I want. A 2x4 and the length I want, and it's dried and it's ready to use. What I'm looking at here in Nicaragua, and understand we're there a week and we're expecting to build, right? Build on this church, at least make some good headway towards them having a building to use, to meet in, to be the church inside of. And here's these trees laying on the ground. And I'm thinking, okay, they must have a sawmill somewhere. No, there's no sawmill. What there is a chainsaw. Now, I don't know, some of you watching this may be like, well, I don't know what a sawmill is, I don't know what a chainsaw is. So let me just describe for you a little bit what I was expecting is this big machine with a saw blade in it. And I'm talking a big machine, because you would put the whole log on this machine, and then it's got a saw blade. And of course, what I have seen is it's all computer controlled, and literally you tell the computer what you want it to do with this log. And then it'll start moving back and forth with that blade running, and it'll begin that process of cutting that log up into the dimensions you want. Then it's got to go into a kiln and dry and so forth. Well, there's no sawmill. There's just trees laying on the ground, and they have chainsaws. And I'm thinking, all right, I understand the chainsaw. That's literally a chain that has blade links on it and a motor, and it runs and it cuts, right? Well, I can see cutting a tree down with that, have cut up firewood and so forth in my experience. But we need lumber. we need structure for this building that we're going to build. And so I'm watching and I'm thinking, okay, what's going to happen here? I'm trying to embrace the fact that I'm in a foreign culture and in an environment I'm not used to, and to just go with how they do this, right? But my goodness, it can be perplexing. You can wonder, how is this going to work? I am not kidding you. They took that chainsaw and they started cutting on those tree trunks. And they started, I would say, carving out with this chainsaw what we call dimensional lumber. It's cut to the dimensions they wanted, and I was pretty impressed. I was thinking, this is really something. I didn't know what to expect. I did not expect this at all. And of course, I'm in awe because remember, all around us is jungle and the sounds of it. And I recognize that we are miles from civilization. And they take these trees that they had cut down a couple days earlier and they just begin to cut them up. And it was amazing. It was remarkable to watch those guys work with a chainsaw and accomplish something that I didn't even know could be done with that tool and in that way. And the next thing you know, we have a pile of lumber. Now it's still not dried. And of course, I had questions about that. And they just looked at me like, nothing around here is dry. why, why or how would we dry it? Nothing around here is dry, including us at that moment. You remember when we were heading out there and that SUV got stuck in the mud? Well, as you can imagine, we had to get it out. So um, we were muddy, right? I mean, how are you gonna get your vehicle out of the mud and work out in the jungle and not be muddy yourself? So I kind of took their point to heart. I'm like, yeah, okay, everything's wet. And my mind's like, yeah, but you can't build with wet lumber. You need to dry this lumber. And yet I'm trying to go, yeah, but I'm in another culture, and this is what they do. And we're in the jungle. We're in Nicaragua. And by golly, we're building a church. It's just awesome. So what an amazing experience I'm having. As we're navigating this whole journey of working to build a church. And it's fascinating to me because all we needed was structural lumber. But this whole process is happening around it. I hope you're getting as much out of this as, I mean, I lived it, so I realize that's different, but I'm hoping you can picture, this whole scenario and what it took, to get to this point to where now we do have a pile of lumber sitting here that I did not expect. Well, now I'm thinking, okay, well, how are we going to haul this? We just have a car and a little SUV. So they're like, here we go. They start piling this lumber up onto the top of the car and the top of the SUV. And I'm thinking, I would never haul anything this way. Is this car and this SUV even going to be able to handle this? But they're piling this lumber up and they've got ropes and they're tying it on there, and pretty soon it's all gathered up on top of these vehicles. And I'm thinking, we're going to make it back out that road, back through that mud puddle, and get to our job site. Really? I don't know. So by now, I mean, a good part of the day, I mean, it's early afternoon for sure, has already been spent, and we've got some lumber, so that's great. We pile it and we start heading back. Well, we had to go back through that mud puddle for one, and we didn't get through it. So now we're taking lumber off to lighten the load. We're carrying that across, right, to drier ground. We're using some of it under tires, to to get these vehicles through the mud. And then we get to the other side finally, and we stack the lumber back on top of the vehicles. Luckily, from there on out, it was not smooth sailing because it's rough roads with ruts and everything, but no more mud to go through. So, we're now approaching mid or even later afternoon, and we're arriving back at our site, where our camp is and where we're building this church. And here we are with lumber, and I'm thinking this took all day. My mindset's being challenged because we would plan it out and it would all get delivered to the site and it'd be there before we even need it, let alone when we do need it, right? I mean, we'd have it there to work with, and man, we'd just get after it and do it. Instead, it's taken all day, and now we have lumber at the site. Fascinating to me. It's so interesting to think about the mindsets of here's how it worked here, here's how it works here. And my normal of what I'm used to being challenged with this new way of doing it. And yet doing my best also in the midst of the heat and the humidity and the bug bites and the spiders and the monkeys and the stuff that's both fascinating and the stuff that's maddening, and the constant wet and the mud. And man, what an experience collecting those building materials. And I was thinking about, you can't build a building without some sort of a structural piece to do it with, right? So I was thinking a little bit about, how does this story translate over into a lesson in my life. I call this the Catalyst Chronicles because there's a story, there's a chronicle that's behind it. And for me, I'm sure some of you already can picture, there was definitely a catalyst for me to think through some things. And I could be frustrated that it takes so long, or that it's so difficult, or that it's, in my mind, a subpar building material. It's a subpar building material. It took too long to get it. Was very difficult. Where at home, I just order in what I want. It's there, and I go to building. I can get frustrated, or I can learn something from it. So I was thinking about, what do I learn from this? And I was thinking a scripture that's very often quoted about God meeting our needs and supply for our lives. And this would be both in a natural sense as well as a spiritual sense. You could even say in a mental sense, right? Um, but Philippians 4:18, some of you already know what this scripture says. It says, "But my God shall supply all your needs according to his riches and glory in Christ Jesus." Now, my point in this video is not to teach on this scripture, because there's a lot right there you could teach on. But my point is that God's interested in our supply. And it's fascinating here in Philippians 4. I would encourage you to go read the whole book. The whole book's not very long, but even just back here in chapter 4, we're encouraged with things like rejoice in the Lord always. Be anxious for nothing. I'm just reading some highlights. The peace of God, which surpasses all comprehension, will guard your hearts and minds. Whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is right, whatever is pure, think on these things. And there's more to that. It's amazing. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. And then it comes to this point of saying, and my God shall supply all your needs according to his riches and glory in Christ Jesus. And I was thinking about this scenario as I'm in the jungle of Nicaragua and the supply of the building material. It didn't happen anything like I expected it to. It was completely outside of my life experience. So what I expected that morning and what transpired over that day of obtaining those building materials were two vastly different things. And yet at the end of the day, we were at that point of supply. So I hope that even though you didn't live it, for me, I lived it. So it's easy to have a lot of visuals in my mind. And, I've painted some of that picture for you. So hopefully some of that has worked for you to where you can picture this very unfamiliar environment, probably to most everybody watching this. Most of us do not live in a remote jungle in a third world country where our very subsistence is determined by what we can collect that day. Not to mention a building project, but even just our food and the quality of our sleep and so forth is challenged by what we can obtain from our environment that day. That alone is such a foreign thing. But here I am watching, and the day began and the day ended with supply, but in a very different way. And I'm thinking about, God's promise to us to care for us and to supply for us is very real and very true and very accurate. I think for me, I began to realize through this experience in Nicaragua of obtaining lumber in a very unique way from what I had ever seen, is to understand that my God is able to supply for me. And don't put it in a box. Don't limit it to here's how he supplies, because it's not limited to that. God's creative. He's full of resource. He's not limited. We are. And he has so many ways in which he can fulfill what he says here in Philippians. Whoop, there go my glasses. Philippians 4:19. I will supply is his promise to us. He doesn't say I'll do it this way or that way, but just that I'll do it. To me, that was very freeing because it opened me up to the idea that my God's going to supply, and it doesn't have to look how I want it to look. So I hope that story can create enough of a picture for you that you can begin to ponder that in your own life and consider what kind of catalyst can this be for change in your life, for adjusting and maturing your belief system and the way you see things. How can it help you to renew your mind to the fact that your God will supply for you no matter what? and he may do it in any number of creative ways, and he's good at that. So there you go. There's a Catalyst Chronicle, and there is actually a part two to this one that I will shoot here before long, so you can watch for that. But I hope that this story has maybe inspired you and been a blessing to you. Thank you so much for joining me and for being a part of Catalyst Chronicles.